All aboard. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The good ship, the fast-moving ghost caboose. Ahoy there. Welcome to my reading of Jodorowsky's The Way of the Tarot. Today, it's time for the Pope. Again, a figure I feel maybe slightly under appreciated. Something we can give a bit of devotion to. And something worth looking at in terms of another deck, a Swiss deck. It's called the Swiss deck. I believe it's from the 1800s, where the Pope is actually Jupiter or Zeus. There he is. And of course, the counterpart to the Pope, the card-giving Pope balance, is his satanic equivalent, the devil. Oh, that's the Pope again. The devil right there. 15. So the devil in the Marseille tarot looks rather different. Here he is, perverse, turned away from God, screw-eyed, not an empty vessel but a parasite acting for himself. We're dealing with someone who gives rather than takes, the Pope. But for what reason does the Pope give? Why does the Pope bother doing this in the first place? I think for me that's what's lying in a sort of dark recess of this card, is the neediness of the Pope to teach, just as I am needing you to be here. No one asked me to do this. No one really asked the Pope in a sense to attempt to be Pope. So we're also going to have a little look at all the other fives, because as the Pope represents the five of the tarot, this is five of swords in the Swiss deck. Isn't it magnificent? I'll show you the five of swords in the Marseille deck. Of course, the curved lines represent the swords. That's how you can differentiate from the wands or the staffs or the batons. Beautiful. If you're interested about the number 5 in the tarot, 5 of discs or 5 of pentacles, have a look at the previous video on the 5 of cups that I did. And, excuse me, 5 of wands, not 5 of cups. That's the 5 of cups. Okay. So step up from security is number 5. The dive into the unknown. So, let me have a little pour there of tea. Taiwanese oolong, although not really oolong, but tastes like oolong. There you go, that's what's going on today. I shall dim my screen so I can focus on the text. Number 5, Le Pape, the Pope, mediator, bridge, ideal. The Pope bears the number 5. This number has evolved from a complete foundation in reality, number 4, security, to acquire an objective beyond its position. The Pope takes one more step than the Emperor. The Emperor is before the Pope in the tarot. The Pope takes one more step than the Emperor. He establishes a link that makes it possible to proceed towards this ideal. Emperor rules, but it seems a little bit more self-concerned and a little bit more stable in navel-gazing, looking towards his own needs, rather than the Pope, which is supposed to be a giving figure, the father figure, the Pope, il Papa, right? The father. In his activity as teacher or pontiff, he is receptive to the upper realm, heaven. So we've taken that first step towards the spiritual set. 1 to 4 represent physical, material gains. 5 is the middle. 6 to 9 are the other set of 4, which represent heavenly goals. What he receives from on high, he transmits beneath him to his disciples. Similarly, he transmits the prayers of his students to the deity, thereby joining heaven and earth. The Pope is ultimately supposed to be a bridge to God. We assume the Pope to be a careerist, perhaps, an opportunist. Certainly, there were some really dreadful popes in history. the anti-popes, for example, destroys the name of Christianity in the medieval period, and there were some well-connected Italian gentlemen whose only desire, of course, was to become pope. But the real ideal of the pope is actually to be the bridge to God, the heavenly and human in one. So our connection as goodly Christians to God, of course. Right. What he receives from on high, he transmits beneath him to his disciples. Similarly, he transmits the prayers of his students to the deity, thereby joining heaven and earth. We could say that he represents the point where opposites meet, the centre of the cross between high and low, left and right. He is therefore a site of circulation among these different poles, which we are able to communicate through him. So, of course, the Pope is not a deity himself. He is supposed to be the intermediary of God. A bit like a relic, you could say, a living relic. I really like to think about relics and how relics being the physical, or the properties or the actual physical body of saints. Relics have quite a big presence here in Portugal. And they are supposed to give the concrete to divinity, or distill divinity in the concrete. They are not themselves to be worshipped necessarily. Their idea is that they're a bridge to for humanity to God, which could be seen as very, very helpful when you're an illiterate carpenter or a pig farmer in southern France of the 1400s. So if you don't read a word, can't write, this relic and the idea of the Pope could be a helpful intermediary. As problematic as that sounds, that's how I try to understand why these things exist in our history. Great. So, and it's really a really great image of Jodorowsky there, that the Pope is the middle of the cross, the heart of the opposites meeting. Seen positively, the Pope is a teacher, an initiator, a guide who indicates to us a purpose in life. The back of his throne has rungs like a ladder. Let's get that card again, but please do look at the Google image that I have, or the image I have added to the description of this video, where you can see for yourself on your screen, instead of my blabbering lips. You can actually have a good look at the colours, the shape, the form, the characters, the qualities of this wonderfully resonant card of the Marseille deck. But the rungs he's talking about are these the platforms behind the Pope, which are the chair. Let me just turn on the screen and making sure. There you go. Yeah. Okay, that's coming up. Great. All right. Seen positively. Okay, we've done that bit. The back of the throne has rungs. Getting myself in a muddle here. The back of the throne has rungs like a ladder. We could say that he unites degree by degree the body with the spirit. His three-level cross indicates that he has dominated the world of matter, that of sex, emotions, and his intellect to create a unity. Similarly, his four-stage tiara represents the four authorities of the individual: body, sex, heart, and brain, to culminate into a single point at the top, a tiny orange circle that touches the card in a unity. A tiny orange circle right at the top of the rungs. It's a very Jewish idea, the idea of a ladder or the rungs to heaven. And right at the top of his tiara, of his headdress, you've got the orange circle representing divine unity, or entrance, I guess, into the divinity. So keywords of the Pope: wisdom, ideal, communication, teaching, verticality. That's a helpful one. Verticality. We're looking up. I mean, in a church, you look towards the font, towards the communion, towards the, you know what I mean. Where the priest, the communion table. That's a sort of vertical idea of that your teaching is through an intermediary, but also that you have to get inspiration for going up instead of through others, which is another form of divine contact, through other people horizontally or through the earth. It's actually, no, straight up into heaven, divine inspiration via intermediary. Thinking of all those wonderful teachers you might have had at school, if you were lucky. I certainly did have some memorable teachers who, it's not even the word, it's memorable, doesn't even go any way to say how wonderful these people were in my lives, my teachers at school. Ms. Nathan, Mr. Hassel, just to name a couple of them. Absolute gods to me, or really intermediaries of gods, the shards of God, the divine light. So thanks to them, wherever you are. Actually, know where one of you is. I'm keeping tabs on you. Okay. Like the high... Oh, haven't done all the keywords yet. Communication, teaching, verticality, plan, mediator, faith, guide, example, to marry, spiritual power, saintliness. Interesting one to marry. We have the lovers, of course, in the tarot, but we've got these two strange figures at the knee of the Pope. Tonsured figures. Tonsured, meaning with their hair cut in that ring, in that circle in the center of the head. Tonsures are fascinating. Why do monks do this? We get this in other bizarre hair traditions, or fashion traditions, I guess, not the word, in Chinese history, with these long trains, I think they call them, can't remember the word, but these very, very long strands of hair, and then shaved bits of the hair to indicate possibly almost a self-humiliation, a way of negating and rejecting worldly beauty in order to demonstrate your focus was on the inner world and the world, or the divine world as well. So it's maybe a bit like a punk rock thing where you deliberately uglify yourself. You put in a pin in your nose to signal, I am more than your worldly ideals, your worldly ideas of beauty. The tonsure. Thinking of the classic saint here, the one born in Alfama in Lisbon, St. Anthony, with this Franciscan-style haircut, the hole on top of his head. I also like to think of the tonsure, as it is here, as a sort of vacuum, a space for God to enter. So God's inspiration can drip its sweet venom into the head as much more quickly if the hair is not there. It's a really nice idea. Now, I say venom, it's a word from the Clair Vision school. Venom is an interesting word for maybe, it's not quite inspiration, but it's something coming from above, from verticality, and that you have to channel healthily in order not to get burnt. To deal with this inspiration well, because it's extremely powerful. Venom has a positive aspect to it. It has to be filtered properly. The same is true with, in a sense, the Greek word pharmakon. Pharmakon, we associate with pharmaceuticals, but it actually meant two things. It meant medicine and drug. So poison and healing. Both were contained in the same word. So the high priestess, he mentions the high priestess. Like the high priestess, as Jodorowsky mentions, the high priestess is number 2, and that represents potential, but a lot of receptivity, learning. So there's a real blueness to the high priestess. Blueness represents intelligence, but also receiving stuff. Whereas the Pope should really, if he's a good Pope, he should be giving. He should be selfless. There's a fascinating part of this chapter where Jodorowsky mentions that the hand of the cardinals on the lower rungs of the Catholic hierarchy, the hand no longer belongs to the cardinal. It's a property of God now once they enter that office. Like the high priestess, that's number 2 of the major arcana, the Pope's vocation is to incarnate divine unity and to teach it to the best of his ability. The Pope's vocation is to incarnate divine unity and to teach it to the best of his ability. Interesting use of the word incarnate as a verb instead of a noun, or adjective, I should say. To incarnate literally means to make flesh. Carn, of course, is flesh. Carnival, carnations, the colour of flesh, the red, and so on and so forth. But to incarnate, what is it? Divine unity, to make God flesh, and to teach it to the best of his ability. I'm also really curious in the Bible how the Word is made flesh. And I feel strongly that that's not just a case of Jesus being the material or the physical manifestation of God. It might be also us uttering the spirit of divine inspiration via speaking. And through the act of speaking, you make real something that is beyond the real, so to speak, beyond the possibilities of normal understandings of reality, ordinary mental consciousness. So, the Pope's vocation is to incarnate divine unity and to teach it to the best of his ability, unlike the High Priestess. The High Priestess is really fascinating because it's supposed to represent, historically, in the old Visconti Sforza deck, which is an old Italian deck, the High Priestess is probably meant to be the female Pope, or the Popess, which was a mythical and very doubtfully true instance where there was a female Pope. And, well, that's a whole other story. But it's a sort of legend, and it's a myth, and it's a very fascinating part of the contemporary tarot. And one of the difficult things we have to deal with here is the gendered nature of the tarot. I'm really trying not to be hyper politically correct here, but it is simply true that wisdom and divinity in this card is represented as a male figure. Now, that encourages us just to look back in history and to try and deal with those ghosts and not sort of shy away from the inherent gender hierarchies within divinity. Of course, we represent God often as him, but of course, and so does Jodorowsky in this text, and he's aware more than anyone about the absolute necessity for us to become the female or the male, our gender opposite. But it also signifies something else which I've completely forgotten about, and I will forget. I will remember as soon as I click end video on this, of course. Right. The green clasp of his cape. Let's try and get that. Good. The green clasp of his cape, where are we? At his throat represents a point within a circle, symbolic of the individual being contained, an essential being in his living core. It is from this impersonal principle that he receives and passes on his teaching. Impersonal. He is the vessel of God. It's not him doing it. He is worked through by God. The divine vessel, very Old Testament word there. It is from this impersonal principle, his divine cape, the green clasp of his cape at his throat, that we see the impersonal principle passing on his teaching. Wow, I'm getting myself all wound up here. Let's keep going. Apologies. It can also be seen as representing the immense labour of concentration that the Pope had to achieve to become what he is. So you're not a dummy if you become the Pope unless you're some kind of puppet Pope. You do have to work hard. You have to know your dogma. You have to do a lot of learning. You have to ascend the rungs of spiritual learning. Karen Armstrong, the author of A History of God, definitely have a read of that if you're interested in comparative religion. She often says, why should religion necessarily be easy? She's not trying to be exclusive there and push away people who or make religion some kind of eclectic cult. That's not her point. Her point is, why should everything come easily? In fact, isn't part of the desire to reach divinity, part of that is a struggle. Is it Aaron's struggle? Wrestling with the angel? Who is it that wrestles with the angel? And for her, Karen Armstrong, she used to be a nun. She became an atheist. She left the convent And then she realized she could contact her own idea, her own sincere understanding of what divinity could be through study, through academic engagement. But the whole point isn't to stay in the brain, in the head, which is a big risk of this vocation. It's actually to get a kind of knowledge that is beyond words. But how do you get beyond words? You need words, so to speak. You have to use words in order to lose them. So a wonderful paradox. So that we have to respect the Pope at least for getting to where he is, whether he may have murdered his way there like some of the old popes who were, two of them I think were actually pirates in medieval history. And yes, actually I think it's at this point worth bringing in the text I've mentioned in the description by Helen Farley, who wrote a wonderful cultural history of the tarot. From entertainment to esotericism, she emphasizes that the tarot used to be a form of entertainment, a game, a thing you play at pubs in 1500s Marseille. Let's never forget that this is a game. We're just playing a game, okay? It's fun. It should be enjoyable. We should be creating narratives and not necessarily predicting the future and thinking seriously. But what does she say about the role of the Pope in this part of medieval history? So she's talking about early tarot history, 1400s, 1500s, particularly central and northern Italy, where the origins of the tarot are, in a sense, first find themselves. A lot of people debate this, but let's just stick with medieval Italy, the Renaissance Italy. And she says the following, and this is really interesting: the enduring strain of economic depression, the unremitting proximity of death, and the difficulties inherent in maintaining even a modest existence began to erode a religious faith. So this is, again, just to emphasize, Renaissance Italy and Marseille, so about the 1500s. The Europe of woodcuts, of rough-hewn artistic expression. The church was riddled by internal strife as factions battled for power, wealth, and territory, resulting in the Western Schism, which saw two popes battling for the loyalty of a divided Europe. So the Western Schism, and I've completely forgotten the date, I think it was 1417, I'm not sure, it's sometime in the 1400s. The Western Schism was two popes battling for the papacy, and it was a grim time and very traumatic. In the same sense that the civil war in England was very traumatic for people because they had seen the figure of Christ on earth, or Christ's intermediary, have his head cut off in 1649, King Charles I. So if you really believe that God is made flesh in the Pope and his head is cut off, the world has turned upside down. And it's the same possibly for the Western Schism. Again, early 1400s, I think, where two popes were battling for the same seat. People must have thought, well, what's going on? How has this church got so corrupted? This perceived, and I'll continue with Helen Farley, this perceived fallibility of God's representatives exposed them as ambitious political contestants rather than spiritual leaders, and this realization manifested in society as an increasing secularization. We associate secularization as possibly the beginnings of the Enlightenment a few centuries later, the French Revolution, Darwin, and that's wrong. That's not right at all. That does not give credit to our historical ghosts, our neighbours who happen to be invisible, yet share the same DNA and flesh and so on. There were many instances of secular movements or desires or momentums, so to speak, in medieval Europe. There are lots of people saying that this whole network, this whole idea of the Pope was wrong. It didn't represent spirituality for them. We had Jan Hus, the Czech proto-reformist. We had Wycliffe in England, who tried to write the Bible in England, and so on and so forth. Many others under-celebrated ones, like the fellas in southern France. What are they called? I remember them later. Who were swallowed up by the Inquisitions. I'm embarrassed to have forgotten the name of that movement, but it will come back later. But these movements bringing the word of God back to the people, teaching the Bible in local languages, for example. Albigensians, the Albigensian movement of Southern Europe. Okay. The perceived fallibility of God's representatives exposed them as ambitious political contestants rather than spiritual leaders, and this realization manifested in society as an increasing secularization. Just to repeat. In tandem with this came a rediscovery of the classical world, and in fact the term Renaissance refers to this revival, of course, rebirth. So the tarot is supposed to contain hidden anti-papal messages. I mean, that's me being way too literal and maybe exaggerating a little bit, but there seems to be hidden stories going on here which show you this doubt of Catholic authority. I'm very aware I might be reading in my own desire to read an anti-Catholic message in the tarot. That's possible, but this is where the tarot came from. This is the soil of the tarot from which this beautiful bush sprung. So why could you say that? Well, the in league with the Pope is the devil. 10 above the Pope, 15 is the devil. And there's certain other very subtle criticisms there. It would be unfair to say criticisms that would be making everything way too literal. But you get my point. So I'm going to lay aside Helen Farley for now. Thank you, Helen. And I think she's still she's a contemporary writer, still going around, quite young, I think. And really recommend her text, Cultural History of Tarot, From Entertainment to Esotericism. Okay, so where were we? So we're going back to the image of the Pope, of course. Each of his hands is marked by a cross, a sign of the fact that he acts in a sacred and impartial manner. Okay, I'm going to have to really lean in there and stop talking for a second, you'll be glad to know. Because I want you to see the kind of cross that's on his hand. Or both hands. Oh dear, I'm not so good at it. There you go. That looks very much like the Order of Christ cross. And I really get this cross imprinted in my imagination. If I close my eyes, I can sometimes see this cross, the sort of fleshing out of the cross. Not this strict 90-degree right angular cross, but one that sort of curves out. You can walk around in Belém, in Lisbon, near Lisbon. Belém is the Bethlehem of Lisbon, a very holy place in many ways, as that's where the ships of the Portuguese Empire set sail. And there was a huge monastery there built to pray for the souls of the sailors. And on the cobblestones you see these Order of Christ crosses. I haven't looked into the chronology here and whether that Order of Christ cross is just on this one religious community, but very quickly the Order of Christ were they were like the Knights Templar 2.0. They replaced the Knights Templar as one of the popes banned the Knights Templar for doing lots of naughty things, including the accusations of rampant homosexuality. There are many depictions of the Knights Templar with two men riding one horse. That was almost certainly vitriol and lies against the Knights Templar by the French king. But suffice to say that these crosses have an uncanny resemblance to the Order of Christ cross. I may be completely wrong here, but it's worth just putting out there in order for it to be knocked down, maybe. The Order of Christ had a very strong idea of servitude. They were the gentlemen, and it was this gentleman who founded Portugal, really. Alfonso Henriques, have I got that right? The first king of the Portuguese? Yeah, Alfonso Henriques was said to be a member. They became rather, exclusive or quiet or hidden or esoteric, and their idea was to instill a kind of people's Christianity in the lands of the Near East. So that's worrying territory, of course. This is kind of not me arguing for the validity and the truth of the Crusades, the goodness of the Crusades, but that really was their idea. A lot of men really believed that they were sowing the seeds of the good news, the gospel, in the Near East in the First, Second Crusades. Okay, on that uncomfortable note, I think we should move on. But keep in mind that cross. His left hand, which is holding the large cross, is light in blue colour, like that of the hermit. I have to stop again, but the hermit is number 9, representing positive crisis. The hermit really sort of is on his own, though, and here we have company. The first instance of more than one human figure in the tarot in the major arcana. 1, 2, 3, 4 only have either people alone or they have animals or spiritual beings, but this is a card of community. So the hermit is very much doing things for himself. Number 9, whereas the Pope should be serving, of course. This can be seen, the left hand holding the large cross, this can be seen as a sign of extreme spiritual receptivity in action. And if we interpret this colour as a glove, a reference to the Christian religious tradition which maintains that the gloved hand of the cardinal is no longer his property, but has become a pure instrument of the divine will. What a beautiful idea. You'd sign up to lead the flock and your body is no longer yours. It could belong to the community, but also is something belonging to God. You're serving. It's not yours anymore. Take it back, or it's been given back to God as it was God's in the beginning. Okay. His right hand is flesh-coloured. His right hand is flesh-coloured. It is reminiscent of the role of union played by the Pope, mediator of opposites. By uniting his index and middle fingers, the intellect and the heart, he is blessing the world of incarnation. He is blessing the world of incarnation, the world of flesh, karn, flesh, meat. His white hair is imbued with purity, but the 2 red clips tell us that this is an active purity. Part of his beard is also white, but the area around his mouth takes on a light blue colour, as if to indicate that the word of the Pope is received. Blue is a receptive colour, also means intelligence, or should signify that. We can also see it as a sign of what is inexorably left unsaid. Master or preacher, priest or prophet, the Pope cannot transmit everything. He keeps part of what he keeps part of what he teaches secret and inexpressible. Interesting. He deliberately keeps some things in his pockets. Pockets are very good, by the way, when you're doing tarot. Keeping the cards in your pocket close to you, but respecting their hidden knowledge, so to speak. I love Jodorowsky's urging for you to walk around all day with the cards in your breast pocket. Breast pockets are also very, very good for tarot. Easier for gentlemen, but if you're interested in spending time with a card, down here in your actual pocket, maybe not so good, a bit dirty, lots of dust, but in the breast pocket, it's sort of a higher realm, and in between of the genitalia and the head, around about here, the breast pocket, sort of a good point in which to do spiritual practice between the genitalia and the head, is sort of the heart, but also this spiritual unity between the cerebral and the bodily. The Pope cannot transmit everything. He keeps part of what he teaches secret and inexpressible, or inaccessible. Interesting. 2 disciples or acolytes accompany him. We should note that this is the first card of the decimal series in which we find more than one human being. Until this card, the figures were alone or accompanied by animals, symbols of their instinctive or spiritual forces. But the Pope would not exist without the disciples that add faith to his teaching. This is key. This is my little snag, my hook, upon which I try to climb up and see the view of what the Pope really could mean. The hidden view of the Pope, or unveiling the darker side of what the Pope could signify. This might leave some of you feeling cold, but for me, this really kind of tickles me. The Pope would not exist without the disciples that add faith to his teaching. They add faith to his teaching. They give a certain charge to the word that the Pope is supposed to know by heart. Thinking of those Islamic scholars who can recite the Quran from beginning to end a lot easier, because the Quran is much more poetic and harmonic sounding than the Bible, but interesting that there's somehow that the Pope is needy, is desiring of sheep. And I think this is let's get straight to it. Slavoj Žižek wrote a book called The Plague of Fantasies, which is as delightful and exciting as his speeches, but also slightly worrying in terms of how entertaining the ideas are. Is it just flashes of philosophical ingenuity, or just rhetorical ingenuity, or does it have something deeper? I really have thought a lot about the following passage, which I'm going to read from page 31 of what my edition of The Plague of Fantasies. I'm just going to get straight to it, where Žižek deals with a theologian called Nicolas Malebranche. And I think, if I remember, I can leave more details in the video about this gentleman. Nicolas Malebranche was the great Cartesian Catholic who put a fine point to this idea of Jesus, not just the Pope, but Jesus being a needy person who actually needed disciples and followers to activate his teaching, and without them, well, something really bad might happen. So the great Cartesian Catholic Nicolas Malebranche, who after his death was excommunicated and his books were destroyed because of his very excessive orthodoxy. Lacan probably had figures like Malebranche in mind when he claimed that theologists are the only true atheists. Theologists, the only true atheists. I find this very convincing in a very strict sense, because they're, of course, really atheists. But theologians are the ones, or monks and nuns are the ones who have spent so much time trying to get to God. To do that, they have to negate what their preconceptions held or expressed God to be. I have spent quite a lot of time thinking, reflecting on the words of atheists I meet, thinking, you're not really an atheist in the sense that you claim to be, because you're just rejecting certain ideas of God, and you haven't explored all the possibilities of God. So in effect, there's a kind of underlying faith there, or adherence to a doctrine that a believer might not have in the first place, because they're talking about something else. They're saying yellow, and the atheist is rejecting the red, and the believer is saying no, but it could be yellow, and the atheist hasn't even considered yellow at all. Okay, I know it sounds rather patronising to atheists. I'm for sure there are actual atheists who've rejected everything, and their writings, like Christopher Hitchens, totally worth reading and fantastic to provoke thought and deepen your own ideas of what divinity could be. Lacan probably had figures like Malebranche in mind when he claimed that that theologists are the only true atheists. In the best Pascalian tradition, not me, Blaise Pascal. One day we're going to spend a lot of time with him. I adore Blaise Pascal, the medieval Jesuit thinker. In the best Pascalian tradition, Malebranche laid his cards on the table and revealed the secret, the perverted truth of Christianity. It was not that Christ came down to earth in order to deliver people from sin, from the legacy of Adam's fall. On the contrary, Adam had to fall in order to enable Christ to come down to earth and dispense salvation. Here, Malebranche applies to God himself the psychological insight which tells us that the saintly figure who sacrifices himself for the benefit of others to deliver them from their misery secretly wants the others to suffer misery so that he will be able to help them. Like the proverbial husband who works all day for his poor crippled wife, yet would probably abandon her if she were to regain her health and turn into a successful career woman. It is much more satisfying to sacrifice oneself for the poor victim than to enable the other to lose status of victim and perhaps become even more successful than ourselves. Okay, well, lots to say, but let's just crack on very quickly with this last bit. Malebranche develops this parallel to its ultimate conclusion, to the horror of the Jesuits who organized his excommunication. They burnt his books, remember. Just as the saintly person uses the suffering of others to bring about his own narcissistic satisfaction in helping those in distress, so God, as ultimately loves only himself and merely uses man to promulgate his own glory. From this reversal, Malebranche draws a consequence worthy of Lacan's above-mentioned reversal of Dostoevsky, which is, if God doesn't exist, the father says, then everything is permitted. Quite evidently a naive notion, for we analysts know full well that if God doesn't exist, then nothing at all is permitted any longer. It is not true that if Christ had not come to earth to deliver humanity, everyone would have been lost. Quite the contrary, nobody would be lost. That is, every human being had to fall so that Christ could come and deliver some of them. There's a terrific meme with this where Christ or Jesus is knocking on the door saying, I've come to heal your sins. And the woman said, well, I don't have any. What do you mean? Leave me alone. He says, no, I've come to give you the sins so in order I can take them away. It's not quite that, but it's really good. Louis Lamprey, you've got it somewhere. If you could dig it out, that would be great. I know you're listening somehow. Okay. What further follows from this is the paradoxical nature of predestination and grace. Divine grace is contingently disseminated. It has absolutely no correlation with our good deeds. The Calvinist idea of it's got nothing to do with your actions. God has given you your freedom, your heaven, before your birth. You have no choice whether you're saved or not. Absolutely mind-blowing that this would be part of any kind of doctrine, but there you go. The moment the link between grace and our deeds becomes directly perceptible, human freedom would be lost. God is not allowed to intervene directly in the universe. That is to say, grace has to remain masked, non-perceptible as such, tucked in the pocket. As a direct divine intervention, since its direct transparency would change man into a slavish entity subordinated to God like an animal, and would deprive him of faith grounded in free choice. So we've got to think about analysis here. Freudian analysis, of course, the patient, the subject lies on the couch, very similar to Catholic confession. The father is there. The subject supposed to know, this is the therapist and the priest, so to speak, which gives us an important outline of what the priest is doing there in the first place. Why does someone become an analyst? Why does someone bother with psychoanalysis? What's the point of doing all of this? It's really important that not too much, of course, respect is given to the father, that we understand our place as most of us lay people who don't join the hierarchies of psychoanalysis or of the Catholic Church, two in my view, very similar institutions. And that in order to really get the word of God, we know where it's coming from. You may have a little bit of suspicion about the potential abuses of power within the Pope figure, the so-called loving father who wants to keep his children trapped. One figure mentioned very consistently by Slavoj Žižek is Josef Fritzl, the Austrian criminal who imprisoned his own daughter in the basement for 23 years. I might have got that number wrong. Impregnated her and raped her. His role is of the ultimate exaggeration of the father figure, of the man who wants to keep everyone in the house so they can't possibly be polluted by the world's influence. That, of course, is extreme end of the abuse of the father. But upon examination, it reveals certain truths existent within so-called normal and more perceptibly healthy father-child relationships. This morning we talked about Bataille and his treatment of the words, of the concepts of transgression and taboo, and it appears from Bataille's writing, to my interpretation, that taboo and transgression are actually condoned within the doctrine that they are actually, in a secret, underhand way, approved of in their limited ways, limited expressions, because, well, we won't quite get into that quite now because we haven't finished the chapter, and it's getting on for 45 minutes. Plus, I don't really know the answer. So, there's the Pope. Let's continue and move away from Slavoj Žižek. Thank you very much, sir. Wonderful stuff. The Pope would not exist without the disciples that add faith to his teaching. These two acolytes represent two distinct positions. We can see that the spinning motions of their tonsures are the opposite of each other. So just to repeat, tonsure or tonsure are the strange haircuts that a lot of medieval monks would have. You know, the shaved hole here, the shaved circle in the head. The Catholic Church actually decided that this was a bad idea in the 1970s, and stopped doing it, basically. So their tonsures are spinning in opposite directions. The tonsure of the disciple on the left, who has his hand raised as if to ask something, and his other hand lowered, is spinning clockwise. The Pope is not looking in his direction. Perhaps it is because this disciple is in error. The movement of his tonsure would then indicate involution, going backwards. Involution is a huge word for my school, the Clair Vision School, my form of, meditation, so to speak. The idea of spinning down. Okay, involution, that's one way of thinking about it, as opposed to evolution. By comparison to the, literally words out of my mouth, but by comparison to the evolution of the disciple on the right. Perhaps it is because it represents what in alchemy is called the dry way, that of study and effort. The dry way is, to some interpretations of alchemy, is a very dangerous form of alchemical engagement, and involves lots of baking, using the perceived breath of the dragon to bake and continue the process to cook natural processes to speed things up. So that's study and effort, symbolically speaking. The disciple on the right, to the contrary, is receiving direct instruction from the Pope through the cross that is touching the top of his skull. He embodies the wet way, that of immediate reception, illumination, and revelation. His tonsure is spinning counterclockwise, and he is holding an odd object in his hands, a dagger or a bilboquet, a cup and ball toy, whose interpretations can be spun out infinitely. And spinning, again, is a huge concept for me of getting into the zone, of transcending ordinary mental consciousness. If you feel yourself spinning when you're meditating or doing something like this, you think you know you're on your way to something interesting. Does he represent a playful attitude? Is he preparing to murder his teacher? Is this a son urged on by the Oedipus complex preparing to punish his father? His nudity is suggested by the flesh-coloured patch facing him. These interpretations impel us to study the negative aspects of the Pope, the hypocrisy of the guru, greedy for riches, the abusive father, the unjust teacher, the hypocrite, the pervert. The Pope, like all the Arcana, has his dark side. There are good grounds for wondering about the vague and mysterious shapes that are displayed beneath his belt, inviting his sexuality and his taste for power to be challenged. But it can also be said that he is passing on the faith that he has received to humanity. In contrast to the high priestess the Pope acts in the world, we could say that he finds support from the temple, whose door is closed, to go out in public and communicate his experience of God to the crowd. This is the challenge of the Pope, in my opinion. This is what we can try and face with the Pope, which is not setting aside the potential of abuse of the Father, but bringing it into our reading of the Pope and looking it in the eye and transcending that discomfort. We have to be mature enough. We have to ourselves be father-like enough to our own spiritual development to accept teaching. To humble ourselves in a certain sense, as it is in our own way correct and helpful to be given instruction. Why do we think it's all us? Why is it all up to us in our individual spiritual engagement to do all the work? We've completely forgotten discipleship. We have nothing of the old Chinese tradition of master and pupil, or going on an apprenticeship, spiritually speaking. That language has gone out the window. So there's an element of discipline and following that, if done consciously and being aware of potential abuse, that can be hugely fruitful. So it's to deconstruct the pedestal on which the Pope sits and become a conscious follower. So it's really hard to stomach this paradigm of the Pope, of the father. Why isn't it the mother? Where's the mother here? It's the medieval tarot. We have to deal with these dichotomies. This also reminds me of a very personal example is the kind of prejudice I see in people who are supposed to know better. And I'm not saying that the prejudice is always wrong. And that's really hard to say. But hear me out. This is an experience I've had in teaching English across offices around Europe. You meet a lot of English language teachers, mostly native speakers, who are rather open with their prejudices. They say Russians are this and Chinese are that and Qataris are this and Egyptians are that. Now, they may be joking, so then this isn't a valid argument, but they might be speaking in a way that they feel is valid and honest to them. They've had a lot of experience to many cultures. A lot of them traveled around the world. A lot of them had to deal with cultural differences. But therefore, in the environment of the staff room, they are very open to their prejudices, or at least being very, very, very much shooting their mouth off, or however you say it, shooting the mouth off. So it could be that we have our own father figures, our own constructions in our head, our own prejudices that if we were very conscious of, we could re-articulate them, and they may be rather symbolic, maybe rather representative, very hard to stomach, but actually at least they're open with their prejudice, rather than, I believe, a much, much more dangerous situation, which is the self-professed liberal. The person who claims to have utter no discrimination to anyone. Absolutely not. I've got no problem with these people. Like hearing classic xenophobic expression. I don't mind these guys walking on the streets with these things they wear, these things on their head. What do they call them? Oh yeah, turbans. Yeah, I've got no problem with it. But this is England, and you can't be proud to be English anymore. It's a crime to say it's good to be English anymore. So those kinds of people are very unaware of their prejudice. I think the problems, the unexamined issues in the darkness, that's the real risk. At least you know who you're arguing with when you're arguing with someone who is openly and honestly prejudicial. The unexamined life is not worth living, so to speak. But really, a lot nicer to think of is that to stick with the Pope, to work with the Pope, is to make peace with the mediator. That's a bit easier than thinking of you as a Fritzl, right? It's to think, okay, well, we can actually deal with this bridge. He's out over there on his own. He could be useful for us, and we're here, and it doesn't have to be all so wrenching and difficult. So it can also be said of the Pope that he is passing on the faith that he has received to humanity. In contrast to the High Priestess, the Pope acts in the world. We could say that he finds support from the temple, or the place. We could say that he finds support from the temple, whose door is closed, to go out in public and communicate his experience of God to the crowd. So in a reading, the Pope could represent a master, a teacher, or a guide, but also an idealized paternal figure. The acolytes would then symbolize his children. We call the priest father. A married man he could represent, strangely enough, someone who's out of reach, inaccessible, a saint. He also symbolizes an act of communication, a union, a marriage, and all the means used for communication. As a bridge or pontiff, the Pope evokes a guided communication that knows where it is heading. In Freudian psychoanalysis, the subject, supposed to know, the figure of authority, is supposed to know, but only supposed to. It's not necessary that they actually know. And the fact that they're wearing the clothes of certainty or knowledge is itself of therapeutic benefit. After the accumulation of the high priestess preparing for birth, the aimless bursting forth of the empress, and the stability of the emperor, the Pope brings an ideal. While remaining part of the material world, he points the way to an ideal dimension with certainty. So, although of course this is usually attributed to a secular leader, we could always think of the emperor's new clothes, denuding, stripping the Pope of his physical, worldly clothing, so to speak, and see what lies beneath. And if the Pope spoke, the Pope is speaking, I am first and foremost mediator of myself. Between my sublime spiritual nature and my most instinctive humanity, I have chosen to be the place where they interact. I am at the service of this communication between the high and the low. My mission is to unite apparent opposites, the center of the cross. A bridge is not a country, it is merely a place of passage. It permits the circulation of the creative energies of this magnificently illusory phenomenon we call life. It is not by isolating myself, but by taking all paths that I am able to announce the good news. Among the traditional interpretations, here's Jodorowsky's list of words. Big breath now. Master, teacher, married man, spiritual man, marriage, union, priest, spiritual guide, sincere or false. Hypocrite, religious dogma, union of heaven and earth, showing the way. Showing the way, just showing the way, not being the way. Connection, self-mastery, expansive vision, emergence of a new ideal, all means of communication, intermediary, desire to communicate, new communication, revelation of secrets, the father facing his children. Maybe the children have to make the father face the music, especially in older life. Like Shakespeare's idea in All the World's a Stage, that the father goes one step closer as he ages towards becoming a baby again. Sans lingua, I can't remember what it is in the poem. The father eventually gets so old that he can't speak, without mind, without thought, without reason. The father facing his children, benediction, questioning faith and dogma. The Pope continues, I incarnate benediction. When facing me, you are in the presence of a mystery. Inhabited by the deity, the most minor gesture I make takes on sacred dignity. To become the sight passed over by divine will, I learn to clear all obstacles from my communication paths, even traces of my own presence. Even traces of my own presence, I become disembodied by the steps towards God. I betook myself to nothingness so that the Supreme Being could occupy all space within me. I adopted muteness so that he and he alone could speak. I banished from my mouth all words belonging to me. I buried my heart in peace and the absence of desires to make way solely for his love, and I eliminated everything from my will, even the will to eliminate my will. I eliminated everything from my will, even the will to eliminate my will. There you go to the potential risks of Buddhism, which is I'm supposed to dissolve my ego. I'm supposed to stop thinking and find a flow. But if you're supposed to become so connected to God, then you've got to even remove the desire to become egoless. Any desire is bad desire. So in my view, a lot of Buddhism still keeps desire and it's unspoken, it's not mentioned. The desire to be nothing, to find unity, is still a desire. It's still a worldly desire. Within me is the same order found in the universe. I am an empty, shapeless vessel that transports the light wherever the wind wills. I place myself between heaven and earth. I urge its inhabitants with the hope of raising themselves to where there are no longer any limits. To everything that is rooted in matter or mind, I communicate the higher power that gives life to what is inanimate. It is through me that the flesh ascends to mind in sublime fireworks. It is through me that the flock of angelic energies descends towards the coldness of matter to dissolve it into waves of magnetic heat. I repulse all curses. I bless everything I hear, everything I see, everything I sense. I summon love like a bird to a dimension beyond measure, so that it may perch upon the smallness of a heart. What can I do about your family squabbles, your hardships, your wounds? I make them kneel down before me and pray. Let me come to you. I will bless your entire world, including your problems. Blaise Pascal says, if you don't believe in God, if you don't have faith, if you want faith, kneel down, get in church and kneel down, and it will come. Obey, obedience, words that are very hard for modern ears to learn. The actual act of kneeling is all it takes in that strict first primal sense. Invest your actions with my mission. Awaken to the strength of the sacred. The least of your gestures, the least of your actions will then become sacred in turn. You will know the experience of one who does not speak in his own name. The cross in my hand is not an instrument for giving orders. It is the symbol... My goodness, excuse me. That's never happened before. Struck by lightning. The cross in my hand is not an instrument for giving orders. It is the symbol of my joyful annihilation. I have pacified my desires, transformed this pack of ravenous wolves into a flock of swallows celebrating dawn with their song. I have turned the tumultuous ocean that agitated my heart into a lake of milk, as calm and sweet as that which flows from the breast of the Virgin. Whoever has thirst may come drink from my spirit. I refuse nobody anything. I am the door that all keys may open. He who has entered my soul can advance to the uttermost limit of the universe and to the end of time. I am the final frontier between the worlds and the unthinkable. We talked in a strict sense of the Pope being fallible and potentially abusive. We've talked of the societal mistrust of the Pope, written within the fabric, dyed in the actual tapestry of medieval Europe from which the tarot comes. This healthy criticism is our way of actually further intensifying our obedience, our discipline. Thank you, one and all, for listening. I'm thinking of all of you in such a difficult time. All aboard the fast-moving ghost caboose tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I hope to see you then. Beijing.